on the map. Its name means Green Cape. But from the air, all you can see are volcanic rocks and cracked land, with rain falling only a few days each year. Out of these 10 islands, only 4 have rivers that flow all year round. Even more surprisingly, 8 out of every 10 pieces of food consumed in this country are not grown on its own land. They first cross the Atlantic Ocean before reaching the dinner table. Logically, Cape Verde should have struggled to survive. But strangely enough, this island nation has one of the highest living standards in all of Africa. A level of development that usually comes from rich mineral resources, oil, or fertile farmland. 3 things that not a single one of these 10 islands has. All these islands have is the ocean surrounding them. And one tradition that has been passed down from generation to generation, a tradition that has become the reason this country is still standing today. The name Cape Verde was given by Portuguese explorers in the 15th century. They took the name from a densely forested cape on the coast of Senegal, a place they passed before discovering these islands. But the islands they found in the middle of the Atlantic looked nothing like that name. These 10 islands were formed by volcanic activity. The land is hard, the slopes are steep, and much of the landscape looks as if it has been forced to survive under the burning sun. The cold ocean currents surrounding the islands also reduce the moisture in the air, meaning rain does not always come when people need it. From the very beginning, Cape Verde was never an easy place for farming. On these islands, drought has always been a long part of history. Since the late 18th century, Cape Verde has been struck by droughts and famines again and again. On average, the cycle returned about every 5 years. The situation became even worse because of deforestation and overgrazing, which destroyed the vegetation that helped the soil retain moisture. When the trees disappeared, the land became less able to store water. And when the land could no longer hold water, one failed rainy season could turn into a disaster. The consequences were devastating. 3 major droughts during the 18th and 19th centuries killed more than 100,000 people through famine. Then, in the 20th century, 2 of the worst disasters struck between 1941 and 1943, and again between 1947 and 1948. Around 45,000 people lost their lives. On Fogo Island, nearly half of the population disappeared. During Portuguese colonial rule, the word famine was even banned from appearing in the media, as if the disaster could be hidden simply by erasing its name. But the problem did not remain only a story of the past. In 2018, a prolonged drought caused the Pualeo Dam on Santiago Island to run dry. For a country that has always struggled to depend on water, the event was a reminder that Cape Verde's agricultural foundation is still extremely fragile. Its impact slowly began to appear in the country's economy. In 2000, agriculture contributed 9.7% of the national economy. By 2021, that figure had fallen to 7.8%. Employment in agriculture declined even more sharply. From 23% of the workforce in 2000, it dropped to only 10.6% in 2021. That means fewer and fewer people make their living from the land. Not because the people of Cape Verde no longer want to farm. The problem is that their land has become much harder to work with. There is not enough water. The rainy season has become increasingly unpredictable. And the cost of keeping agriculture alive continues to rise. Today, much of the country's drinking water and irrigation water depends on seawater desalination. This technology helps, but it is expensive. To turn seawater into usable water, the country needs a huge amount of energy. Meanwhile, almost all of Cape Verde's electricity still comes from fossil fuels that have to be imported from abroad. As a result, the country's water crisis and energy crisis are closely connected. The greater the demand for water, the more energy must be used. And the more energy the country needs, the higher the cost it has to pay. The IMF even describes the combination of drought, water scarcity, and dependence on fossil fuels as one of the most fundamental development challenges facing Cape Verde. In the dry valleys of Santiago Island, this reality can be seen in everyday life. For the older generation, farming is a way of life. But for the younger generation, the fields are beginning to look like a future that is simply too difficult. More and more young people are leaving their families' farms. Not because they have lost their connection to the land, but because the available water is no longer enough for everyone who wants to continue farming. Long before the modern water crisis became a major problem, Cape Verde had already found another way to become valuable. Its land did not offer much, but its location in the middle of the Atlantic made these islands impossible for ships traveling between Europe, Africa, and the Americas to ignore. Since the 15th century, these 10 islands have stood along one of the world's most important sea routes. Ships crossing the Atlantic needed a place to stop, refill their supplies, repair their vessels, and connect one continent with another. This was where Cape Verde first gained its economic importance. In 1497, Vasco da Gama stopped at these islands during his voyage to India. 2 decades later, in 1519, the first expedition to sail around the world, led by Ferdinand Magellan, also passed through the same route. For a small group of islands with land that was difficult to farm, the arrival of these great expeditions proved one important thing. Cape Verde may have been poor in natural resources, but its strategic location gave it value. Unfortunately, that same geographic advantage also opened the darkest chapter in its history. Throughout the 16th and 17th centuries, these islands became a major transit point in the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved Africans were gathered here before being shipped across the Atlantic to plantations in the Americas. Cidade Velha, on Santiago Island, grew into one of the most important ports in the triangular trade connecting Africa, Europe, and the Americas. On Santiago and Fogo, sugarcane and cotton plantations expanded through forced labor. The wealth that appeared on these islands did not come from fertile land alone. It came from a brutal trading system that treated human beings as cargo. Then, when the slave trade was abolished at the end of the 19th century, that old economic foundation collapsed as well. Cape Verde lost the source of prosperity that had supported its ports and plantations for centuries. But as had happened many times throughout the island's history, geography once again offered another opportunity. This time, it did not come from sailing ships carrying people across the Atlantic. It came from steamships. They needed fuel, communication, and a place to stop in the middle of the ocean. The port of Mindelo, on São Vicente Island, soon became the new center. During the age of steam, Mindelo turned into a major coaling station and a transatlantic telegraph hub. Ships crossing the Atlantic stopped there to refuel. At the same time, the telegraph network connected this small island to the flow of global communication. At the height of its success in the 1920s, nearly 2,000 ships stopped in Mindelo every year to take on coal. Once again, the same pattern appeared in Cape Verde's history. Twice, Cape Verde almost lost the foundation of its economy. And twice, its location in the middle of the Atlantic offered a new opportunity. Not from something growing out of its soil, but from the outside world constantly passing around it. Mindelo's golden age, however, did not last forever. As the world's ships gradually abandoned coal and switched to oil, the once busy ports slowly lost the reason ships stopped there. Shipping routes changed. Ships no longer needed coal stations like they once did. At the same time, competing ports such as Dakar and the Canary Islands gradually took over the role that had once made Cape Verde important in the middle of the Atlantic. Once again, the islands lost one of the pillars of their economy. But this time, the solution did not come from a new port, a new mine, or new natural resources. The solution came from something much more human. The people of Cape Verde themselves began to leave. In fact, the roots of this migration had been planted much earlier. Since the beginning of the 19th century, men from the islands of Brava and Fogo were recruited by American whaling ships from Massachusetts that stopped in Cape Verde to replenish their supplies. Some of them settled in New Bedford, where they worked in the whaling and textile industries. Some even established their own transatlantic shipping routes to bring more people from their homeland. That community eventually grew into the largest Cape Verdean diaspora in the United States, a position it still holds today. Every time a crisis struck, whether drought, famine, or economic recession, a new wave of migration followed. The pattern was passed down from one generation to the next. Today, it is estimated that more than 1 million people of Cape Verdean descent are living around the world, while fewer than half of them actually live on the islands themselves. Around 500,000 live in the United States. Another 260,000 live in Portugal. The rest are spread across France, the Netherlands, Senegal, and several other countries. A diaspora of this size is more than just an interesting demographic fact. It directly supports the country's economy through the money sent home every month. And the amount of that money is so large that if it suddenly stopped flowing, it would shake the country's entire financial system. Today, Cape Verde's economy is built mainly on services. Trade, transportation, tourism, and public services together account for around 3/4 of the country's economy. Tourism is its biggest economic engine. However, the sector depends heavily on Europe. When the European economy slows down, the number of tourists visiting Cape Verde also declines. The problem is that the country records a large trade deficit almost every year. Most of its basic necessities have to be imported from abroad. From food and fuel to consumer goods. This gap is filled by foreign development assistance and money sent home by the diaspora. In 2024, remittances were equal to 12.3% of Cape Verde's GDP. One of the highest ratios in sub-Saharan Africa. For such a small country, that is an enormous figure. The money sent by families living overseas does more than support individual households. It also helps keep the country's overall consumption running. Foreign exchange reserves provide another important safety cushion. By the end of 2025, Cape Verde's international reserves stood at around 1.06 billion euros. Enough to cover more than 5 months of imports. That gives the country some breathing room. But it is still a thin cushion for a nation that depends so heavily on imported goods. At this point, Cape Verde's biggest weakness becomes clear. Its two most important sources of income are both outside the country's control. Tourists who come from other continents. And members of the diaspora working in foreign countries. If either one is disrupted, the effects can quickly reach households across the islands. That is why Cape Verde has managed to build an economy despite its geographic limitations. But that success always comes with the same risk. The country grows when the outside world is doing well. And it is shaken when the outside world begins to struggle. Since the early 1990s, Cape Verde has been recognized as one of the most stable democracies in Africa. Power changes hands through elections. Opposition parties are able to win. And political transitions usually take place without major unrest. That stability was once again demonstrated after the municipal elections in December 2024. The victory of the opposition party, PAPE, immediately led to a cabinet reshuffle and became an important political signal ahead of the parliamentary elections scheduled for April 2026. Cape Verde's semi-parliamentary system also allows the president and the prime minister to come from different political parties without causing the government to slow down. For a small country that depends heavily on international confidence, this kind of political stability is a major advantage. Its limited natural resources have also shaped its politics. Cape Verde has no large oil reserves, no giant mines, and no vast areas of fertile land that political elites can compete over. As a result, political competition is not centered around controlling a single massive source of natural wealth. Its debt structure is also relatively safer than that of many other developing countries. Around 2/3 of Cape Verde's external debt is owed to multilateral lenders such as the World Bank, the African Development Bank, and the IMF, mostly in the form of concessional loans. For a country whose economy depends on tourists, its diaspora, and foreign assistance, this kind of stability is not just about politics. It is part of the country's strategy to maintain the confidence of the international community so that investment, financial support, and economic cooperation continue to flow. The government of Cape Verde has also begun trying to address its water crisis through technology. In São Domingos, a solar-powered desalination plant was built through a cooperation project worth around 807 billion Indonesian rupiah with Hungary. The project increases the country's water supply by nearly 900,000 cubic meters every year and benefits more than 1,000 farmers. Seawater is now being turned into irrigation water, allowing agriculture to depend less on increasingly unpredictable rainy seasons. On a different stage, Cape Verde also made history. The small island nation qualified for the 2026 FIFA World Cup, marking its first appearance in the history of the world's biggest football tournament. For a country as small as Cape Verde, global attention like this is about much more than football. It is a form of recognition that the country rarely receives through economic achievements alone. A nation that is usually overlooked on maps of the Atlantic suddenly found itself on television screens around the world. Cape Verde's next challenge lies in two directions. making life on the islands more secure through water technology and innovation, while continuing to ensure that the outside world keeps seeing, visiting, and staying connected to this small island nation. These 10 volcanic islands have never had rich mines to exploit, oil to pump, or vast fertile land to cultivate. What they have is the ocean surrounding them, shipping routes that happen to pass nearby, and generations of people who chose to leave whenever their homeland could no longer provide enough to live on. And from that tradition of leaving, the country discovered its own way to survive. But by allowing them to go as far as they could, while continuing to send part of what they earned back to the islands they had left behind. Indonesia, with millions of migrant workers spread from Hong Kong to Saudi Arabia, may already be familiar with this pattern. The difference is that on these small islands in the middle of the Atlantic, leaving home stopped being an emergency solution a long time ago. Instead, it became the foundation that has supported the country from one generation to the next.